This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Good to have you guys back with me this week. I have not done a solo episode in a really long time, and I kind of wanted to go a little bit old school today. I'm on summer break right now, which means I have a little bit more time to do recording, and I don't have to rely as much on interviews and things like that. So I'm going to try to record a bunch of solo episodes that are kind of like the old school Protestant Libertarian Podcast. It's a big throwback to 2022. But today I want to talk about inflation, and I want to talk about how the military-industrial complex, this network of arms dealers and Congress and the people that wage our wars and the military, I want to talk about how all of those things are impacting our society today. And I do think that there is a really big impact between the inflation that we are currently seeing in the United States right now and all of the wars that we've been fighting for basically my entire life. So I want an opportunity to break down what inflation actually is and then explain how not only the disastrous wars in the Middle East that were fought in the name of the war on terror, but then also the current war that we are waging via proxy in Ukraine all contribute to a lot of our economic problems in the United States, because there's a really big connection between those two things that most people just simply do not understand. And it's not their fault. We don't learn about any of this in school. Like when you go to school, you say the Pledge of Allegiance every day, and you learn that the U.S. military is always a force for good in the world. And again, when I make critical comments about the military, I'm not talking about the individual 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers, most of whom sign up because they really do believe that they're doing the right thing and trying to serve their country. I'm talking about the politicians and the arms dealers who are funded in large part by the politicians. And I'm talking about the generals and the leaders in the military that make all of these decisions that are, in my view, completely disastrous. And we also don't learn about economics in school. In reality, like a lot of people might go to school and learn, maybe you take one econ class in college, or one econ class, not even college, but maybe you take one econ class in high school, and you might talk about Chicago school. Maybe you'll learn about Milton Friedman for one day, but people don't actually study economics and understand how these economic terms work. And so I want to kind of give you guys a chance to think through inflation today, how it's affecting us, and how the wars have played into this. So we're going to get started with an article that was published over on the Mises Institute's blog. And again, you should always read the Mises Institute's work. It's great. Mises.org is where you can go. And this article, which was published on May 29th, 2023, is entitled "Fewer Americans Say That They Are Doing Okay Financially." It's written by Robert Arro over at the Mises blog. And so, obviously, I'm sure if you're listening to this episode, you've seen it. You go to the grocery store, you buy something on Amazon, everything's a lot more expensive than it was before. And a lot of people don't understand why everything is so expensive. And so this article, in this article, Arro is going to try to explain why fewer Americans say they're doing okay financially, and then what some of the factors are that could be driving that. So we're going to get into this article, and then we're going to kind of go into some other issues that are related to what I believe is fueling the inflation that's ultimately making things worse for us. So he says this: in a 2022 survey of over 11,000 respondents, it was found that 73% of adults were doing at least okay financially, meaning they reported either doing okay or living comfortably. This is 5 percentage points lower than the prior year and one of the lowest observed since 2016. These findings were published by the Federal Reserve in the report titled "Economic Well-Being of U.S. Households in 2022. The report attempts to examine the financial lives of U.S. adults and their families. With the data collection occurring in October of last year, the time lag is considerable. Overall, the report shows that higher prices have negatively affected most households, and overall financial well-being declined over the prior year. Notable highlights from the fact sheet include this: the share of adults who said that they were worse off financially than a year earlier rose to 35%, the highest level since the question was first asked in 2014. Some renters indicated that they had difficulty keeping up with their rent payments. 17% of renters were behind on their rent at some point in the prior year. Nearly two-thirds of adults stopped using a product or used less because of inflation. 64% switched to a cheaper product, and just over one-half, 51%, reduced their savings in response to higher prices. The focus of the report primarily revolves around capturing sentiments, emotions, and perspectives on financial well-being, but it fails to delve delve into the underlying causes of any of the hardships noticed, which just as a side note, of course, the Federal Reserve isn't going to dive into any of the underlying causes of the hardships because the underlying cause of almost all of our economic woes is the Federal Reserve itself, as we'll talk about in a minute. They said, for example, one finding is that higher income adults were more likely than lower income adults to mention financial challenges related to retirement. Yet this is hardly a new concept, as the Austrians explained how the expansion of the money supply affects people and prices differently over a century ago. He's talking about Austrian people that adhere to Austrian economics, people like me. Certainly, wealthier individuals tend to be more insulated from currency debasement, but it is also because those who receive newly created money first benefit at the expense of all others. And here's one of the ideas that we really and truly need to grapple with today. The term inflation does not refer specifically to an increase in prices. Now, a lot of that language, and we're going to look at a passage in Mises in just a few minutes where he explains this in more detail, but it's very popular to hear pundits and politicians referring to price inflation, which is an increase in the cost of goods and services relative to previous costs of goods and services. That's price inflation, but that's not what inflation is. Inflation is an increase in the money supply. That means an increase in the quantity of money in a market. And that will lead to higher prices, to price inflation, if there is not a concurrent increase in the number of goods and services that are also available within that economy. So in other words, if the amount of goods and services available for purchasing in an economy stays the same, and the quantity of money increases, which is what the Federal Reserve is responsible for doing, increasing and contracting the quantity of money to try to target certain inflation numbers. That is how much money is in the economy. So if the number of goods and services stay the same, but the money supply increases, then costs are going to go up. If there's no concurrent increase of goods and services along with the increase in the quantity of money, then you're going to have price inflation. But people get price inflation and good old-fashioned inflation confused. And as Aro points out in this article, it's all of this newly created money that is leading to these higher prices. And there's this effect within Austrian economics that we call the Cantillon effect, and it's named after the economist. I think his last name was Cantilia or something like that. I should have done my homework on that before, and Mises talks about him a lot. But there was an economist who came up with this idea called the Cantillon effect. And the problem with a money system like the one that we have in the United States, our monetary system is a fiat monetary system, meaning that all of our money is fiat money, i.e. created by the government. It's not hard money. It's not like gold and silver, and it's not a decentralized monetary system. Instead, all of our money is technically the property of the government under the purview of both the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. So in a fiat money system, whenever new money is printed, and there was in the last 3 years, because of the response to coronavirus, about $5 trillion brand new dollars that made their way into the economy. Whenever this money is introduced into the economy, it's going to benefit certain people first, because that new money will make it to people that are connected to the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and then the politicians that want to allocate that money. So like with COVID, we're going to look at a Reason Magazine article here, or at least a little bit of a Reason Magazine article here in a few minutes. With COVID, the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act or the American Rescue Act rather, were all passed under the notion that the money that was going to be spent would go to average Americans who had to incur a very large financial burden because of the coronavirus pandemic, or because of the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. But in reality, if you take a look at how that money was actually spent, a lot of that money went to very well-connected corporations, the airline industry, the banking industry, certain food industries. There were all kinds of massive corporations that received that money. And what they were able to do with that inflated money is purchase more goods and services at pre-inflation prices. Because when the government releases new fiat money into the economy, it takes a while for those prices to rise. So the people that get their hands on that inflated money first get to buy goods and services at that lower cost, whereas the rest of us who receive that additional money over the long run through either higher wages, or some people never really receive it at all, especially if you're working in an industry that did not receive all of the money from the government, this newly inflated money from the government. There are some people that never recover from that, and there are a lot of consequences to to that system. So Arro's going to go on, and he says, this report does support the idea that year after year, life becomes increasingly difficult as dollar purchasing power continues to decline. This can manifest as unaffordable rents, price increases, and a general sense that the future looks bleak. All the while, the increase in interest rates, as we've been told is necessary to combat high prices, has only made the cost of carrying debt even more burdensome. At best, the findings inadvertently shed light on the merits of Austrian economics, revealing the inherent issues arising from the problem with controlling the money supply and interest rates, both of which fall within the purview of the Federal Reserve. Of course, the Federal Reserve is the one who they make decisions about the quantity of money that will be released into the American economy. And again, this isn't free currency. This is all government issue currency. It's our fiat money. It's our legal tender. Like, we have legal tender laws in the United States that make it to where you cannot buy and sell with money, legal tender, that is not officially sanctioned by the government, which is why there's such a war that's being waged by our politicians against Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is outside of that fiat system, and they view it as a threat to the money supply, which our politicians control. So that is just a massive issue with this. So again, they're going to say that the money supply and interest rates both fall within the purview of the Fed. And of course, interest rates, if you go to the bank and get a loan, the interest rate that you receive for your loan is affected by the interest rate that the Fed gives to the banks, or the Fed sets for the banks that work with the Federal Reserve. So your interest rates as a borrower are going to reflect the levels of interest that are set by the Federal Reserve. So the Fed controls the interest rates of the loans that you receive. It serves as a stark reminder, continues Arro, that a fairer world would exist if the global financial system did not rest on the whims of a select few individuals. And so we find ourselves living under the plan of a central bank that continues to examine the detrimental consequence of its own policies more for public spectacle than anything else. I'm going to stop and take a drink here while you think about that. Yeah, delicious water. Anyways, so going back to what we were discussing here with inflation, inflation is when there's an increase of the money supply in an economy. And in our current monetary system, the Federal Reserve is ultimately the one that controls the money supply. So here's the thing that you need to think about, because I know that I have some people that listen to the show that might be a little bit more progressive leaning. And again, as I've said before, I think a lot of progressives have a really good heart. They want to use the government to help those that are in need. And I just think that there's a failure to understand that that almost all, or I would say all, of the economic interventions that are employed by our government actually wind up making people worse off in the long run. And this is an excellent example of that. So it was really Richard Nixon, the Republicans. So if you want to blame somebody, you can blame the Republicans. And in fact, if you look at it historically, the Republicans always talk about how they're like limited government and fiscal conservatism and all of that kind of stuff. But then they wind up spending more money and imposing more economic controls than the Democrats do. It's just one of those very interesting lessons of American history. And again, I'm looking directly at thinking of directly George W. Bush as I say this. But in 1971, Richard Nixon officially took the United States off the gold standard. So we had fiat money in the U.S. up to that point. Like, we had government issued money, but it was at least in part backed by gold. So that if you wanted to, or I think that at that point, only other countries that were using the United States dollars could redeem their dollars for gold, but at least there was something hard. There was something real. There was something objective behind the U.S. dollar. And then in 1971, we get off the gold standard. Well, since 1971, the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar has declined by 80% because the Federal Reserve sets these targeted inflation rates where, they try to increase the quantity of money year in and year out. And so I think they usually their targeted rate of inflation is usually like 2%, which doesn't seem like much. But if you think about it, let's say that you're living in 1970, before Richard Nixon takes us off the gold standard, and you have $100,000 in a savings account that you are willing, that you want to save and use for your retirement, and you're going to retire in the year 1980. So if you have 2% inflation for 10 years, let's say between the year 1970 and the year 1980, then that means in effect that the purchasing power of that $100,000 has been decreased by 20%, which means that in 1980, when you retire, that $100,000 that you saved will only buy $80,000 worth of the goods that it would have bought just a decade before in 1970. And here's the reality about money. And Mises talks about this a lot in his work. The quantity of money doesn't really matter in an economy. It doesn't really matter how much money there is. What matters, if people want to make responsible economic plans for the future, is that that quantity of money remains the same, because that's the only way that you can actually calculate the real cost and the real value of goods and services. And that's really all that prices are a signal of how much things are worth in a given economy, how much a good and a service is, how much it costs to produce, and then how much it is worth for consumers to buy it. That's the function of prices, and prices are all determined in money terms, right? So this is why having a stable monetary supply is so important. But instead, the government has consistently tried to inflate the monetary supply in order mostly to benefit itself. Again, Murray Rothbard says in The Anatomy of the State that the state is inherently parasitic, that the only way for a government to generate revenue is by taking it from the people through taxation. But then what happens if the people are unwilling to be taxed? Kind of like in the American Revolution, where you have the Boston Tea Party and our unwillingness to pay like a 2% tax on tea. So what happens if the government cannot, if it's not politically feasible for the government to continue to tax people at higher rates, but they want to increase the amount of money that they have to spend it on items and on programs that they think are important? Well, you can increase the supply of money. But if the government doesn't control the supply of money, then they have to, then they really don't have an option to do that, which is one of the reasons why fiat money is so insidious. And for every progressive that thinks that we live in a capitalistic free market society, I'm sorry, any society where the government is in control of the supply of money, like our government is, and like the Federal Reserve determines how much makes it into the market, any society that has a controlled form of currency, a government issued currency, is by default not a capitalistic society. It's because the government controls the medium of exchange, which is kind of like that is the absolute fundamental, basic, rock bottom economic resource. And again, if you think about this philosophically, if there's someone down the road from you that is selling you a product that you want, why should you be restricted to pay him with money that the government has issued? Why can't you just pay him with whatever he's willing to accept? If you have a medium of exchange, if he wants rocks, why couldn't you go and get some rocks out of your backyard and give him that? If he's willing to accept those rocks as a form of payment, then he should be able to do that. The problem is that in that free money system, the government cannot come in and tax that as efficiently as it can if it controls the entire monetary supply. And that's the reason. And Mises, again, in his works, Mises makes this point over and over again. The real reason why governments love fiat money, the real reasons why governments love to control the supply of coins, and even if it's a hard money system, the government might control the issuing of gold and silver coins. The reason why the government loves controlling money is because it makes it easier for them to tax it and use it for whatever our politicians think are most beneficial. And that's the real reason behind inflation. Now, Ludwig von Mises is going to talk about this. There's a really great, again, I recommend going to Mises.org, and you can find a lot of these little books on Amazon too. But the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, they have gone back and taken a lot of lectures and things like that were given by people like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and Friedrich Hayek, and they often turn them into little books. And there's a really great one, if you want to understand how money and inflation work, there's a really great one. It's called Ludwig von Mises on Money and Inflation, and it's compiled by Bettina Bien-Greaves, who I believe was an associate of Mises for the Mises Institute. And so it's a bunch of lectures that he gave back in the 1960s where he explains basically how money emerges on the market and then how that inflation works in practice. And again, he's saying these things before we are taken off the gold standard in 1971 under the Nixon administration. So I'm going to read a passage from this book here because I think it's really, really important. So he says this. He says, people now call the increases in prices inflation, while in fact, inflation is not the increase in prices, but the increase in the quantity of money that brings about the increase in prices, as I was saying before. Mises then goes on. People nowadays don't talk about the increase in the quantity of money. This is a subject that the representatives of our official doctrine do not wish to mention. They speak only of the fact that prices are moving upward, this the effect they call inflation. They do not mention all the preceding fact, the cause of the upward movement, the increase in the quantity of money. They imply that government has nothing to do with it, that government wants only to keep prices stable. They simply assume that the upward movement of prices and wages, which they call inflation, is caused by the wickedness of people outside of government, by bad people who are asking for higher prices. This is the myth of corporate greed that people like Elizabeth Warren peddle, saying that whenever there's an increase in the quantity of prices across the market that takes place as the result of an increase increase in that quantity of money, people like Elizabeth Warren say it's all corporate greed, as if all the corporations just colluded together to raise the prices all at once, and that not a single one of those corporations would realize that if they had lower prices than all their competitors, that they would actually generate more revenue. Okay, so the government lies about inflation all the time because the government causes inflation and they use it to benefit themselves. And this goes back to the Cantillon effect that I said before. The government gets to decide how to spend all of this newly inflated money, so they get to spend it on whatever they want at pre-inflation prices, while the rest of us have to suffer the cost of an increase of the prices of goods and services as a result of that. It's inherently rigged. Mises goes on. The second problem is the actual increase in the quantity of money itself. Let us talk about a fantastically small country. Let us say Ruritania. Its government wants to raise money for some of its expenses. The government says, for instance, certain workers should get higher salaries. The total amount of government taxes is 1 million units of the monetary unit. Yes, but the government wants to spend 2 millions. The government adds to the million units it has taxed away from the citizens a second million, which it is printed especially for this purpose. The result is that an increased quantity of money is exchanged on the market against a not increased quantity of real goods, of consumer goods, and so on. And this means that prices must necessarily go up. The government has a group of learned men who try to conceal this very simple relation by using terms that sometimes mean nothing and sometimes mean precisely the opposite of what is really going on in the economic system. That's an incredibly illuminating passage by Mises there. So again, these prices that we're seeing right now. And again, these prices really hurt the working class. And for those people that think that capitalism is a system that encourages consumerism, really one of the driving forces behind consumerism are artificially low interest rates, which the Federal Reserve is responsible for setting, which means that banks are more willing to give out loans to people that they know cannot pay them back. And those rates of interest don't reflect the real risk that the banks are incurring by handing them out on the market. So when you have artificially low interest rates, it's going to encourage people to consume more than they would otherwise by giving out loans to people that are not in a financial position of being able to take them back. And this is really kind of the big insidious factor that lies behind this whole student debt relief thing, is that there have been all kinds of government programs and regulations that have encouraged lenders to give out these massive student loans to students that would never be able to afford them otherwise. And because of that, colleges know that these students are going to be spending more money at their schools than they would otherwise, which causes colleges to expand the services that they provide, thereby increasing the cost of college, which means that the loans then have to increase in price. And so it creates this death spiral where people are getting all these loans they can never afford to pay for goods and services that are artificially inflated in price. In a free market, it would never work that way. This only works because the government is in control of the monetary system, and because they create perverse incentives that allow bankers and banks to get away with giving out loans to people that can't pay them back, and that encourage people that can never pay them back to take them. This inflationary policy also hurts people that save, because again, let's say that you work a good paying job and you live within your means and you just put as much money back as possible so that you can prepare yourself for retirement later on down the road. Well, again, if every 10 years the quantity of money that you have in a savings account winds up losing 20% of its purchasing power, then how are you ever going to save enough to provide for yourself in the future? And so it actually makes a lot of sense. If you know in 10 or 15 years that the value of your money is going to decrease, then that provides an incentive for you to spend more of that money now, which fuels consumerism and fuels kind of a lot of the reckless economic behavior that we see. And of course, companies are going to respond to that by providing people with cheaper goods, with more fashionable goods. Instead of building things to last, they're going to build things based on this idea that people are going to spend that money as quickly as possible, knowing that it won't retain the same value in 10 years as it has today. In other words, the purchasing power of that money will decrease. Now, COVID was a massive accelerator to this entire process. Sorry, I need another drink of water there. And there's an article on Reason. I'm not going to read all of it, just the first couple of sentences, but it's an article that was written in February of 2023 by Eric Boehm over at Reason. It's called "COVID Stimulus Spending Played Sizable Role in Inflation." And the article is essentially a branch of the Federal Reserve admitting that the increase in the quantity of money that took place as a result of the CARES Act and Donald Trump's CARES Act and Joe Biden's ARA actually is leading to higher higher prices. So it says stimulus spending played a sizable role, according to the Fed, in driving inflation to 40-year highs in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We find that excess inflation is significantly correlated to each country's own domestic stimulus and to various exposures of foreign stimulus, concluded a trio of economists at the St. Louis Federal Reserve in a report published last month. In the U.S., they found that the fiscal stimulus during the pandemic contributed to an increase in inflation of about 2.6 percentage points. That's a significant increase, even if it doesn't account for the full run-up of inflation that took place during the past 18 months. Price increases accelerated, and again, I think here there's a confusion between kind of the Misesian Austrian way, the real traditional way of understanding inflation as an increase in the quantity of money, and the way the Federal Reserve likes to spin it to the media, where it's actually an increase in the cost of prices. Because then, again, and just to put this back here, because I don't think I said it before, but one of the reasons, and Mises kind of alluded to this in his book, but one of the reasons why politicians and pundits like the term price inflation is because it makes it seem like it makes it seem like the responsibility for the increase in prices is upon the companies that are raising their price and not upon the politicians and the bureaucrats that increase the quantity of money. So it's a way of very subtly shifting the blame to the wrong group of people. Not that I like big corporations, because most of them are propped up by government regulation anyways. Like a lot of the corporations that exist out there would not exist in a truly free market society, which is something that we maybe we'll come back to later today or on another episode. But anyways, price increases accelerated in late 2021 and throughout 2022, ultimately peaking at an annualized rate of 9.1% in June. In the report, the three economists note that governments around the world responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by injecting large amounts of money into the economy via various mechanisms. The large increase in demand triggered by the fiscal stimulus policy, together with the slow pace of adjustment in production, likely contributed to the current imbalance in the goods market, they wrote. The increase in demand as the world was still recovering from the blow that the pandemic dealt to production facilities and supply chains, and the disconnect between supply and demand naturally forced prices to climb. So that's all I'm going to read from this article. I'll put a link into it. You should go and check the rest of the article out because it's really very good. But we had an even bigger problem with the inflation that took place during COVID than with regular injections of government money into the economy, say for fighting the war on terror in the Middle East. Because the problem is, not only did the government and the Federal Reserve decide to print $5 trillion out of nowhere and just inject $5 trillion into the American economy, but because of all of these different COVID lockdown policies and safety measures, we actually were at the governments were actually at the exact same time restricting the quantity of goods and services. So there was less being produced because of all of these government demands and government regulations that made it impossible for companies to produce at the rate that they were before. So in a normal inflationary environment, you have a stable amount of goods and services in an economy, and then you have an increase in the money supply, which means that those goods and services, the prices are going to increase. But with COVID, you actually had a decrease in the amount of goods and services that were being produced in the economy, while you had at the exact same time an increase in the quantity of money. So this is going to lead to even higher inflation numbers than inflation. This is going to lead to, even higher prices than inflation usually generates. And we have to absolutely understand that that is the reality. Like that is what is taking place, and that is the driving force behind our economic woes. It's the fact that the government spends way too much money, which is why they're having I'm recording this in early June, by the way. And so this is why they're having, I know the political situations I'm going to talk about in a minute. By the time this is released in late June, everything might have changed because we live in a very fluid world right now. But with the price increases that we're seeing right now, all of this is a result of government inflation, and especially the government's response to COVID. Now, things still would have been bad because you're going to have higher prices, even if the quantity of money stayed the same and the amount of goods and services in the economy decreased. That will also lead to higher prices too, because it's the same amount of dollars chasing fewer goods and services. So that naturally would have led to it, and that still would have been the government's fault because the government was the one, or in this case, it wasn't the federal government. I mean, I would blame Fauci for a lot of this because despite his protestations, he was the one who was recommending recommending that state governors lock down their states and prevent people from going into work and earning a living. But it was these state and local governments that shut down businesses, shut down restaurants, that actually led to a decrease in the quantity of goods. So we were going to have we were going to have this inflationary policy no matter what, and we were going to have an increase in prices no matter what. But the government's response to COVID accelerated those trends. But COVID's not really the only factor to blame for this. So we all know that on September 11, 2001, the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon were attacked by Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of a group that was labeled terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda. And we responded by invading Afghanistan and Iraq and starting a 20-long-year war in the Middle East that we are still technically fighting in some countries overseas. And those wars cost a lot of money, like a lot of money. So I want to transition into the second part because we're fighting a proxy war with Ukraine right now, and I know that if you might be a more progressive-oriented listener, that might kind of bristle you. It doesn't maybe sound like the narrative that you're used to hearing on television or on radio shows or in the news. But the reality is that we're fighting a proxy war with Russia because the United States government is funding Ukraine by giving them money to buy weapons and bombs from American arms manufacturers. That's how we're supporting the war in Ukraine right now. And really, warfare has been for decades now, since World War II, one of the biggest expenses that our government incurs. So it was when I was a kid in the early 2000s, like when I was in middle school and high school, I always associated the anti-war movement with progressives because it was the liberals that were speaking out against George Bush's overreaches overseas. It was those people that identified themselves as progressive, and they were the ones that used terms like military-industrial complex and things like that. They were very much against these wars that they believed that George H.W. Bush and the Bush administration had lied us into, or at least were responsible for starting. And there's definitely a ton of truth to that point right now. But a lot of progressives seem to be very much supporting the war in Ukraine. So it's very interesting how the left has kind of moved away from its fundamental anti-war stance over the last 20 years. And the only people that seem to be raising any sort of concern about what's going on in Ukraine right now are they're not the conservatives, but there's a very small handful of conservatives that seem to be expressing a concern about what's happening in Ukraine. The reality is that wars are incredibly expensive, and that's one factor that drives a lot of the problems that we are facing here in the United States. So even if you're a progressive, or maybe you're someone who's just a little more of like an old school kind of liberal, maybe like a JFK kind of liberal, you believe that there's a role for government to play in providing welfare services for people, food stamps, public schools, roads. You want the government to pay for those kinds of things. Well, there was a study that was released by Brown University. I guess this was 2 years ago. I think it was on like it was close to the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And this article from Brown University, I'm gonna put a link to this in the show notes. But the headline is "The Cost of the 20-Year War on Terror." That is the wars in the Middle East that we have waged in the wake of 9/11. They cost $8 trillion and resulted in 900,000 direct deaths. So a report from the Cost of War Project at Brown University revealed that 20 years of post-9/11 wars have cost the U.S. an estimated $8 trillion and have killed more than 900,000 people directly. And you can read the rest of the article there, but those numbers are massive. So if you're a progressive, imagine what kind of programs could have been funded with $8 trillion. And then for those of you that are like me, that are into Austrian economics or free market economics more general, what would happen if the government just didn't spend that $8 trillion over the last 20 years? That is a lot more money that would have been in the hands of consumers and producers to make individual decisions about how to peacefully produce and exchange with one another. That's massive. That's massive. And considering the fact that the war on terror didn't really seem to work, and that we were lied into Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're kind of funding a genocidal war right now in Yemen, and everything that happened with Pakistan. I mean, the war on terror was a giant failure and completely morally unjustified. And there are a ton of people that served in the military that are turning away from the idea that those wars were ever morally justified. And again, on the face of it, $8 trillion, 900,000 deaths, that is a massive toll to take on those people that are overseas, and we as taxpayers paid for all of that. Now, a lot of that $8 trillion cost was inflated money. So it was new money that was created by the Federal Reserve, going back to the Cantillon effect, again, in light of the bank bailouts in 2008, when the government engaged in quantitative easing, which is simply printing more money. I'm sure a lot of these defense contracting companies that make the guns and the bombs received a lot of that money. So there was a lot of it to go around. That $8 trillion didn't need to be spent. If we'd have had lower taxes for the last 20 years, and that $8 trillion could have been put into something, I believe, a lot more effective. Now, I'd love to go into the background on the war, but that's going to take us a little too far afield today. But I do want to talk about the way that I do want to talk about the impact that this has on the American worker and the American consumer, because ultimately we pay for these wars, and we either pay for them because the government taxes us more, which it often does, and it taxes us more because they need to buy more guns and more bombs and all of that kinds of things to fight these perceived enemies overseas. So they either do it through taxation or they do it through inflation. And as we've said before, inflation winds up hurting all of us because it punishes people who are responsible and want to save, and it increases the cost of all the goods and services across the economy. So it's really inflation, government inflation in a fiat system is a silent form of taxation. We don't consent to it. We don't have any choice over who winds up sitting on the Federal Reserve. We don't have any input in our supposedly nominally democratic society over the amount of money that makes its way into the economy. It just happens because a handful of people in Washington decide that it needs to happen, and then we have to pay the cost for that. And one of the biggest government expenditures outside of welfare is warfare. And I think year over year we spend more money on warfare than we do welfare. It's a giant drain on the American economy. And if you're listening to this show, you're probably already skeptical as to the moral validity of these wars. And this is not a new phenomenon. So I'm going to play you a clip on the show here before, and this was of President Eisenhower. So very famously, President Eisenhower, at the very end of his term in office, again, Eisenhower was a 5-star general in World War II, incredibly brilliant general, and he became president of the United States. And when he was done with his term as president, he gave a speech on his last day in office, which was, I believe, in 1961. Okay, so Dwight Eisenhower is president, and then John F. Kennedy is elected president after him. Dwight Eisenhower serves his 2 terms. Okay, so he's president from 1953 to 1961. And during that time, he helped build up the military in order to fight this Cold War against the Soviet Union. So the 1950s were this time when we'd come out of World War II, and now the greatest existential threat to the human race was the Soviet Union. And in order to counter the Soviet Union, we built up what Eisenhower termed a military-industrial complex. And he warned about the dangers that this military-industrial complex would cause the United States if we continued down this path. Now, again, he's responsible for helping build up what he calls the military-industrial complex, but he warns that if this continues unabated, that it's going to have catastrophic consequences for the American people. So I'm going to play about a 2-minute clip from that speech, and then we're going to talk about the reason why this military-industrial complex is still going strong today and how it affects the American consumers. Let's take a listen to this clip.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Man, was Eisenhower right. Again, the point that he makes there at the very end when he uses the phrase military-industrial complex is he's saying that essentially if you have this complex, if you have all of these people, and I think at that time he said like 3 million people in 1961 were working for these defense companies and in the arms industry, and I think the Department of Defense right now is the U.S. Department of Defense is the biggest single employer in the entire world. You create an incentive for warfare, because you have all of these people that financially benefit from the United States fighting in overseas wars. In other words, millions of people are making a lot of money off of these wars. And so this creates a state of affairs where very powerful people are going to get us involved in conflicts just so that they can make money off of the American people. And there's no real market for this, because the average American is not going to pay for guns and bombs for wars that they don't think are just. Never mind sending over our brave soldiers who signed up to actually defend our country. Never mind sending them over to a battlefield where they might get killed for mission objectives that are very nebulous to begin with. And again, the war on terror was very, very nebulous. And so this is a giant problem in our society. And from the 1950s on, we've had this military-industrial complex of defense contractors and politicians that work for them and all of that make money off of war. And I really do believe, and this is not the time and the place to go over history of the war on terror. That's going to happen hopefully sooner on the show rather than later. But I really do believe that that was the biggest calculus for the war on terror. It's the reason why we got lied into Iraq. George W. Bush knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, and that Saddam Hussein, who was our ally in the 1980s, by the way, but he knew that Saddam Hussein was not responsible in any way, shape, or form for 9/11. But what did we do in March of 2003? We invaded their country. We bombed their water treatment facilities. We bombed their infrastructure. That was the whole plan of shock and awe. And then we still have troops stationed in Iraq right now. And Saddam Hussein and Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Now, that doesn't mean that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, but the Bush administration lied us into war in Iraq. And if you look at Dick Cheney, the vice president, he worked for a defense company called Halliburton before he became the vice president. And there's this really interesting dynamic in our government where a lot of the people that make these decisions, of course, Congress doesn't declare war anymore. They had the authorization for the use of military force. I think they passed one for Afghanistan in 2001, one for Iraq in 2003. It's not a formal constitutional declaration of war. It just gives the executive branch kind of a large discretion to make decisions on potential battlefields, decisions that they see fit, by the way. But we got involved in all of these wars for a very long time. And these politicians that were connected with these arms companies, many of them either go and work for these arms companies when they are done with their time in Congress, or they get elected to Congress after having worked for these arms companies, or they're appointed to a cabinet role or whatever. There are so many people in our government that are involved in these defense companies and that profit from the United States being involved militarily overseas. And you look at the case of like a place like Afghanistan. Like Afghanistan was a country that we should not have occupied. Osama bin Laden was living in eastern Afghanistan at the time, but it was pretty obvious that by the end of 2001, he had slipped out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban was not the de facto government of Afghanistan was also not responsible for 9/11. Like the Taliban rule in Afghanistan might not have been great, but our invasion and occupation of that country was completely unjustified because there was no connection between the Taliban and 9/11, even though the Bush administration did everything that they could to try to ensure that was the case. And then if you look at Obama and Trump, Obama dramatically increased the war on terror. It spilled over into, I think, 5 more countries under his watch. And of course, he increased the very, very expensive drone program. Most of these drones were used to bomb, and I laugh because it's sad, most of these drones were used to bomb innocent women and children. And the Obama administration has said, well, this is the cost of fighting a war on terror. You're going to have collateral damage. And so the deaths of these innocent people overseas are of no consequence to us because we're doing it for the greater good. We're doing it to try to stamp out terrorism. So we do all of this. And then Barack Obama makes this nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. And the government of Iran is a Shiite government. So that's like, it's kind of like there's the Catholic Protestant divide within Christianity. You have the Sunni Shiite divide within Islam. So Iran is a Shiite government. And one of our major allies in the Middle East, and really the country that was our home base for the war on terror, was Saudi Arabia, and they were Sunni. And the Saudi Arabian government had really gone to bat for the United States for the entire war on terror, and they didn't like that Barack Obama had made this nuclear treaty with Iran because they believed they're in kind of a regional competition with Iran, and the Saudis believed that this was going to increase Iran's standing within Middle Eastern politics. So they asked Barack Obama to do him a favor in order to kind of pay obeisance for the fact that he made this deal with Iraq. A government took over in Yemen, which borders Saudi Arabia. It's kind of the south, on the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula there. And a government took over Yemen that the Saudi government didn't like. And it's a different group of Muslims that took over the government of Yemen. And so they convinced Barack Obama to fund this war with the Yemenis. And the Yemenis were of no threat to the United States. And in fact, there were people that fought for Saudi Arabia in Yemen who were actually a part of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So Barack Obama starts giving them all of this money for them to buy American guns and American bombs, things that our defense companies produced, in order to wage this proxy war on behalf of the people that we were supposed to be fighting against in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then at that time, Syria as well. So the whole thing didn't make any sense. But you know who benefited from all of these wars? The defense companies did. So Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, all of these major, GE, all of these major defense companies made billions and billions of dollars off of these wars in the Middle East. And all for what? I mean, we paid for them as taxpayers, right? Like either we paid for them in the form of higher taxes, which did occasionally occur, or the government inflated the money, which meant that we paid for it in terms of higher cost of goods and services. And there's also a giant misallocation of resources. All of that metal that's used to make the armaments that we send overseas could have been used to build things like roads and bridges and not utilities, but things like appliances and all of that kind of stuff. So just all in all, a giant waste of money, but the people that benefited the most were those that were the most connected to the government. And there are a lot of progressives out there that are completely sold on the correct idea that the war on terror was a giant lie, and that we never should have engaged in the war on terror in the way that it was just an exercise in nation building that enriched the defense companies. But they don't see the same thing happening with Ukraine. So I want to break that down real quick because I know we're running out of time and I'm trying to keep this short today. But there was an article published April 29th, 2022. Okay, so this is a little over a year ago, but the point's the same. This is over on antiwar.com, which I read almost every day, and I really believe that you guys should do that as well. Great reporting on all things foreign policy. So this article is very short, and I'm going to read a piece of it to you. It says this: Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he's Secretary of Defense for Joe Biden, said one of the U.S.'s goals in Ukraine is to see a weakened Russia. He also said the U.S. is ready to move heaven and earth to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. Again, they're being very open that this is a proxy war. That's exactly what it is. So our support for the war in Ukraine is we're not really supporting the Ukrainians out of the goodness of our hearts. Like, this isn't about like our politicians benevolently deciding that they think that the women and children of Ukraine should have a better life. This is about us winning a war against Russia. That's what this is all about, destabilizing Russian power. The first statement contains no goal of saving Ukrainian lives. This is because saving Ukrainians is not a major focus of U.S. war aims in Ukraine. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu, sorry about that, called out America's disregard of the staggering death and destruction there, saying there are countries within NATO who want the war to continue. They want Russia to become weaker. Apparently, heaven and earth in the second statement includes billions in weaponry, but not a single pair of U.S. boots on the ground. Nor does it include American warplanes, even a no-fly zone to counter Russian air superiority. That telegraphs America does not consider the Ukraine war critical to America's national self-interest that risk a single American life. U.S. policy boils down to Ukraine does the dying, America does the supplying. The U.S. has never once, and here it is, the U.S. has never once offered negotiation as a path towards peace. For the U.S. to enter negotiations, they would have to cease denying the provocative history of the U.S., NATO, and ultranationalist and Ukrainians' actions towards Russian borders, including the killing of 14,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donbass. Refusing to address the tortured history makes a negotiated settlement virtually impossible. That leaves endless weaponry, provoking even stronger Russian warfare, guaranteeing the killing goes on throughout 2022, per Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or even several years, according to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley, which is, of course, what's happening right now. But endless war and death is just one of several calamities facing the world by using weapons and its less violent policy mate sanctions instead of negotiation. Worldwide recession may now be more likely than not. Flowing from worldwide recession and sanctions crippling supply chains, millions in poor countries may be doomed to starvation and death from policies proclaimed as lifesavers. Again, there is a massive economic impact towards funding this military-industrial complex. They say some things about nuclear weapons and things like that, but it says it is counterproductive for the U.S. to substitute weapons and sanctions for diplomacy if it is truly interested in peace. That's very, very, very true. And so he's going to go on to talk about this. America and its fervent media supporters should be supporting, demanding even that our government use negotiations, the only means of bringing this horrific war to a prompt conclusion. Endless demonizing of Russian President Putin also makes even starting such necessary negotiations difficult, if not impossible. That leads to a fair question many in the peace movement and others are asking. Is the U.S. supplying endless weapons but to negotiations simply to wage proxy war fought by Ukrainians, primarily to isolate, weaken, even affect regime change in Russia, rather than to save Ukrainian lives? We need every media organization in America to begin asking the tough questions that could provide an off-ramp from endless war, worldwide recession and starvation, and most importantly, possible nuclear war. Okay, so we're going to be in this for the long run, probably, but what's the calculus? Obviously, our government says that they want to undermine Russia, but it's coming at a very high cost to American taxpayers. All that money that they're spending, that money, all of the congressional appropriations to Ukraine, there's kind of this myth out there in the media that a lot of people hold on to. And that myth is that all of this money, all of this, they call it aid, but they say that all of this aid that's going to Ukraine is helping somehow the women and the children over there that are being innocently affected by this war. But that's not the case. All of this money that we're giving to the Ukrainians is being used for guns and bombs and planes and drones and all of these things that are going to continue to keep the war going and going. And right now we live at this time where prices are out of control. A lot of companies, they might have because there's so much more money in the economy, we see that a lot of corporations have positive gains in terms of the nominal amount of money, that is like the number of dollars that they are getting quarter after quarter, but the actual real value of that money is decreasing. A lot of companies are really struggling, but if you look at whose stock portfolios are doing the best, it's the stock portfolios of all of these defense contractors. So there's a really interesting thing too, and this just goes back to this revolving military-industrial complex door that I was talking about before. It's a really interesting thing at the beginning of the article. Our Secretary of Defense, who is responsible within the Biden administration for making a lot of these military decisions and advising Biden on a lot of these military decisions, is the Secretary of Defense, Department of Defense, is Lloyd Austin. Okay, so and there's an organization called OpenSecrets.org that is designed to it's not designed, but the whole goal is to follow how money works in politics. And what's really interesting about Lloyd Austin, it says this. This is from OpenSecrets.org. Lloyd Austin became the first black Secretary of Defense after the Senate confirmed him to the post on January 22nd. Austin served in the U.S. Army from 1975 to 2012. During his stint as head of U.S. forces in Iraq, Austin reportedly befriended Joe Biden's son, Beau. Austin was then nominated to become the Army's vice chief of staff. Just a year later, then President Barack Obama tapped Austin to head up U.S. Central Command. After the election of former President Donald Trump in 2016, Austin left the public sector and assumed position on the corporate boards of steel manufacturing giant Nucor Corporation, Tenet Healthcare, and United Technologies, which merged with defense contractor Raytheon Company in 2020. And Raytheon is one of the greatest defense contracting companies in the country, maybe the greatest. This merged corporation, Raytheon Technologies, is among the top 5 lobbying spenders in the defense sector and spent almost $11 million on lobbying in 2020. Austin earned 7 figures from the defense companies. Austin stepped down from all 3 board positions following his nomination in 2020. Prior to joining the Biden administration, Austin worked alongside fellow cabinet member Antony Blinken at Pine Island Capital Partners, a private equity firm investing in defense companies that touted its access to Washington. So for those of you that think that the war on Ukraine is just about us being benevolent to those that are being afflicted by this war, there's without a doubt a financial motive in all of this. And again, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, one of the most powerful men in the entire world, used to work for Raytheon. And although he claims that he's divested all of his stocks and everything that he had in Raytheon, he's got to have some friends over there. And even the experience of working for a defense contracting company is going to factor into this calculation. And so the military-industrial complex that we currently have, not only is it leading us down the path to a war with a country that most Americans I have no personal problems with anyone living in Russia. None of them are my enemies. Vladimir Putin's probably a horrible person, but all politicians are. So is Lloyd Austin. So is Joe Biden. These are all criminals, right? I mean, they all do things that the rest of us are not allowed to do in the name of self-defense or whatever. They make all of these excuses up. These are not good people at all. The only way that we can stop this is by criticizing the military-industrial complex and calling them out for what they are. And this whole war in Ukraine, regardless of what you think about Vladimir Putin and the invasion and all of that, at the very least, we have to acknowledge that the people that are calling the shots in this war have a massive financial incentive in this war continuing for as long as possible, because the more guns and the more bombs that are produced to fight this war, putting innocent people at risk every single day, the more guns and bombs that are produced, the more money these people in our government make. That's just the way that it works. That's the reality behind this system. And they're going to blame everything else. They're going to blame Putin. They're going to blame the global supply chain. They're going to blame racism in the United States, whatever it is. They're going to blame everything else except for the fact that our corrupt politicians make money on all of this stuff. That's it. That's the reality behind what's happening in Ukraine right now. And this is a big driving force behind the high prices that you and your family, who are just trying to make it in the United States, good people who have never hurt anyone, this is the reason why you are paying so much for your groceries, or to put your kids in sports, or to buy your kids clothes. This is the reason for it. So the people like Lloyd Austin and Joe Biden and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and all of them can make millions and millions of dollars while innocent people have to die all over the world. Just completely unacceptable. Now, we've been going on for almost an hour, and I'm going to try to wrap this up here in just a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to give a couple of reflections on this here. So, progressive Christians, and I would love to sit down on a progressive Christian show and just talk about all these things, because I do believe that there are a lot of progressive Christians that believe in government intervention in the economy because they want people to have the best possible quality of life. And they believe that a government monopoly on charity is the best way to accomplish that. So I understand the sentiment. The economics, as we talked about in the first half of this episode, just don't work. So there's a very famous passage at the end of 2 Timothy where Paul is talking about wealth in the church. So he's writing to Timothy, and he's trying to explain to him how to instruct people within his congregation. So he talks about people that are wealthy. Paul says to Timothy, "For we have brought nothing into the world." This is starting in verse 7. So 1 Timothy 6:7 and following. "For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." And then he goes on to continue in verse 17. "Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all good things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that," sorry, I lost my page here. Here we go. So that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. So again, Paul's solution to this problem is that the temptation for wealth is overpowering, and those people that have wealth should voluntarily use it to serve other people. Paul is not telling Timothy to call up his local proconsul and raise the corporate tax rate to try to give to the poor. Paul is encouraging Timothy not only to be generous himself, but to encourage those within his congregation that have the means to do so to help those that are in need. It all has to be voluntary. And if you think about it, these people like Lloyd Austin and like those that work for the Federal Reserve and the politicians and the bureaucrats, they make money not on dispensing charity and dispensing dollars to those that are in need. They make money by being in control of the money supply, and they get to determine the cost of money. And then they get to regulate the economy in a way that benefits the big corporations and the big businesses, so that those corporations and businesses don't have to provide value to the consumer. They just have to get on the right side of the right politicians. And this is even more perverse and more insidious with the defense contractors who are responsible, in my opinion, for the 20-year war in the Middle East and now the war in Ukraine. It's also that these rich people can continue to enrich themselves, and they're doing it with our money. And they're doing it in a way that deliberately kills innocent people, completely reckless, completely at odds with Scripture. So if you're progressive, I hope you think about that. The idea behind charities is it's got to be voluntary. And if we don't make it voluntary, if we give the government the power to organize charity, and this is a conversation for another day, but if we give the government the power to have a monopoly on charity, which is essentially what welfare is, it's a government monopoly on providing charity, which is something that the church is supposed to do, not the government. But if we give the government a monopoly on this, just like we've given the government a monopoly on violence in terms of fighting war, then they're only going to use it to benefit themselves. It's going to create a large bureaucracy of well-connected patrons, and the people that these policies were designed to help will never receive the help they need. It's why we declared war on poverty in 1964, and we're still fighting that war. And arguably, the kinds of people that were poor in the 1960s are still poor today, maybe even more so because of the increase in the quantity of money. The last point that I want to end on today, too, is Christians. We should be the first people. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I have a lot of respect for pacifists. But I do believe in self-defense. But as Christians, we should be the first people that are willing to call out those that are willing to use violence. Like we have, and this doesn't mean that there aren't times when self-defense is justified and necessary. But whenever our government, who has made billions and billions of dollars and then taken billions and trillions of dollars to wage their wars, whenever they say we need another war, and the people that are saying we need another war are also benefiting financially from that war, we as Christians should be the first ones to call that out. I know we're going to talk about this more on another show, but one of the most beautiful passages and what we're going to end on today is in the prophet Micah. And Micah says this, talking about the last days, the day when God returns to rescue his people, which was inaugurated with the death, resurrection, ascension, and enthronement of Jesus. All right, he says, and it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will come to it. Many nations will come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth a law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. The church is the nation, the family of Abraham, that has experienced the latter days. We're living them right now. And the latter days don't mean the days before God destroys the world. This is the time when God restores the world through the work of his Son and the power of the church. And during this time, nations will learn to not fight against each other. Following up immediately after this passage in chapter 5 of Micah 5, 1 through 4, says this, now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With the rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, for you one will go forth from me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor is born a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel, and he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strengths of the Lord. And the majesty of the name of the Lord is God, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great on the ends of the earth. We all know who that's talking about. All right, well, guys, thanks for hanging on today. I really, like always, tried to make this 40 minutes, and it wound up being an hour, but that's okay. A lot of good information here. I would check out the articles that I mentioned in the show. I'm going to put links to them, and, of course, the Mises book that I referenced in the show notes. Thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast and for hanging in for a whole hour. I really appreciate all that you guys do. It's great. One more thing. Here in a couple weeks, I'm going to be headed to Freedom Fest in Memphis, Tennessee with my friends at LCI. So I will be at Freedom Fest from Wednesday to Friday. So if you are in the Memphis, Tennessee region, come and check out the LCI booth. You can meet me. You can meet Jacob Winograd of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. I think Carrie Baldwin will be there. Doug Stewart will be there. So we have all kinds of great people coming down for that. You can meet the LCI team, and I'm really excited about this opportunity. So yeah, if you're in the Memphis area, come on out and check out Freedom Fest. That would be great. So again, you guys are awesome. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.